looks like we're here and can begin our afternoon. My task is only the happy one of welcoming you on behalf of the Center for the Study of World Religions. My name is Frank Clooney. I'm a professor in the Divinity School and director of the center. And we have a number of colloquia each year on different themes and from different approaches. In the past, we've had colloquia on translation. We've had reading groups in Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault. This year we have another colloquium on comparative studies, all different methodologies in different disciplines and fields. In the spring we'll be starting one on Orientalism and religion, gathering faculty and grad students from around the Divinity School and the university in this room or in the front room where you'll generally be meeting. So it's very exciting to be able to, as the center, to host this event. I'd like to think that from the center's founding in 1960, there have been many discussions in this room, the common room, that cross the boundaries between the theory and the practice, between the ideals of religions and the realities on the ground, with the hope and the expectation that good can be done and that real contributions can be made to peace. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had Professor Atalia Omer from Notre Dame speaking on the role of the scholar in relation to the very difficult issues on the ground of Palestine and Israel, and what role a scholar can play. And it seems that this colloquium and all the sessions that follow, but particularly starting tonight, will be wonderful contributions in this regard. So I promise to be brief, and I think I've said enough just to welcome you and thank you all for coming. And David.
Thanks, Frank, very much for hosting us and making this facility available. So just to add my welcome to everyone, thank you for coming, especially to people from other schools at Harvard, to people outside Harvard who've come. So thank you for giving your time. I guess the road to this afternoon kind of started for me at convocation in 2012 when I'd just become Dean of the Divinity School and had to think of a subject to speak about at convocation. And I knew my own expertise in work would bore everyone senseless, so I decided not to do that. And spoke a little bit more about my background and growing up in Northern Ireland, as someone else in this audience, Hugh O'Doherty, did as well. And spoke about the subject of the fog of religious conflict, which actually took on more of a life than I was expecting. I think the kind of interest that it stimulated took me a little bit by surprise, given that I usually speak about my work. So that was, and really building up from that, we've had a number of discussions and encounters, and now we've got to this stage of having a year-long colloquium. So this initiative on religions and the practice of peace, which we started at HDS this year, really seeks to stimulate cross-disciplinary scholarship on how communities worldwide, past and present, have drawn on religious and spiritual resources to foster mutual understanding, harmonious relations, cooperation, human well-being, justice, and peace across differences of religion, sect, nationality, ethnicity, and culture. The initiative emerged from the recognition that while a great deal of academic attention has been dedicated to the role of religion in inciting violence, the positive role of religion in preventing violence or building sustainable peace really seemed to me to be understudied. Part of that sense of it being understudied was that I just didn't know what had been studied. I've now got a new library of books and realized it wasn't quite as understudied as I thought. This is the joys of academic life. But still, I think comparatively understudied when you put it alongside the amount of work that goes into religion and violence. And this is dead obvious on TV. You just watch cable news, any 24-hour cycle, and you'll have any number of retired colonels or CIA experts or who will have all kinds of opinions on what needs to be done in different parts of the world, and really comparatively very little analysis of how these problems got to be there or what could be done in the long term that might make a long-term difference as opposed to a short-term necessity. Knowledge of how members of religious communities are contributing and might further contribute to cultivating peace, we think is essential for ethical leadership in our highly religious and culturally very diverse world. It's vital these days for educators, policymakers, peace practitioners, religious communities, and the general public around the globe to think more deeply about these matters. I'm convinced that universities can do a great deal to promote constructive engagement across differences around the world, and believe that here at Harvard and HDS we're especially well positioned to do so. I think we want to be well informed and anything but naive in our discussions here. I mean, one of the things I learned in Northern Ireland, and I know Hugh will feel this the same, is that there were any number of well-intentioned ecumenical ventures, some of which we probably were involved in, which kind of floated above the surface of things, and I sense, of having grown up in a working class East Belfast background, that somehow this just didn't touch the ground. What was going on at the grassroots was really tougher, meaner, more difficult to get at, more driven by identity conflict and in many cases unemployment, poverty, discrimination, and so on. So I think as we set out on this venture, we don't want to be a kind of naive upper middle class Harvard ecumenical pontificators. I'm sure we'll be that anyway, but but we'd like it to be deeper than that, and want to go into this with a sense that that we know there are no quick answers and no quick fixes and no easy solutions to many of the problems confronting us. We're nevertheless very pleased to be launching this colloquium this year as a first step towards stimulating the kind of collaboration around Harvard and Greater Boston that might get us on good tracks. So we're excited to have received enthusiastic interest from faculty here at HDS, from the Committee in the Study of Religion, from our colleagues at the Law School and the Kennedy School, from our guests from local universities and the peacebuilding field generally, and from our graduate students. So we're grateful to each and every one of you for your presence. Thank you for making time. I look forward to your contributions throughout the year. There are many more people who will come who couldn't come this evening. So we're hoping that we will have about a gathering of between 30 and 40 at each of our colloquiums. I want especially at this time to thank Dana Eck, my partner in this crime. Dana, as you know, does not need an introduction, director of the Pluralism Project, and someone who has rich experience of these issues over many years. So Dana, thank you so much for partnering with us in this venture. Also like to thank Liz Lee Hood, sitting at the back, who has done really all the hard work, and I mean all the hard work, in getting this going. Liz has been a really phenomenally industrious and generous person with her time and expertise, and as you know from the communications you've all received from her. So Liz, we're very grateful to you for supplying the energy and the drive behind this colloquium. Thank you so much. I'd like to just reiterate my thanks to Frank Clooney, CSWR, to Lexi, for helping us so graciously with the planning, including all the arrangements for meals and so on. I know this takes a lot of time and effort, and it doesn't come easily, so we really appreciate what you do for us. Thank you so much. So the plan for the session today is that I'll hand over very expeditiously to Diana, who will introduce our speaker and presenter today, Darren Kew, and we'll start with that presentation and some Q&A. Then at around 5, we'll take a break, get up, get some dinner, food, move around, and we'll reconvene pretty sharpish. I mean, so bring food back with you and so on, and we can start eating again, or start the conversation again and eating again. And our aim is to be completely finished by 6 o'clock, and we'll stick to that rigidly. But if you need to go before then, obviously that's fine also. We'll finish off at the end of the day with a few announcements about our future program and sort of highlights that are on the way. But right now, Diana, please come and introduce our speaker. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I'll say just a word that when I was, it must have been about 20 years ago or sometime quite a while ago, I had a call from Scott Appleby, who has become very well known in these studies, and he was working at that point with Martin Marty to develop the Fundamentalism Project, and he described what they were about, and I got pretty interested in it, but I realized as that conversation developed that I was a lot more interested in the other people, the people who were not the fundamentalists, but who were really working very actively to develop relationships with one another across lines of difference and ethnicity in complex societies. And that became sort of the genesis of the Pluralism Project, the fact that we didn't really know too much about what those people were doing, although they seemed to be doing a lot, or at least there were initiatives. And that really is one of our questions, too, that we do live in religiously, ethnically complex societies, and how we, all of us, learn to live creatively, constructively, and to develop peace practices is one of the most important questions of our time. And it really is the hard work of living together and engaging in the practice of peace. That's an interest that has pursued me for some time, but I, a little bit like David Hempton, don't really know that much about it. I have a sense of what's going on one place or another, but I really am interested in the tough and mean stuff at the grassroots that is also perhaps offset a bit by some really creative stuff at the grassroots. And that, I think, is some of the things we're about. There's a reason that we don't hear that much about it. You don't want to blame everything on press or on fellow colleagues, but it is true that we hear a lot more about conflict and violence. And that's because that's what people send their reporters out to do. They don't necessarily send their staff of investigators out to find out how people are cooperating with one another and what they're doing. And that I think is a very important question. So it's a great place to begin today. I first met Darren Kew at a very interesting and long, very much longer than any of us intended luncheon that he and Dean Hempton and Liz Lee Hood and I were all part of over at the Dean's residence this past summer. And that included Imam Ashafa from Nigeria, the Imam in the Pastor and the Imam. And Darren had brought him here and has had a long relationship with him. Darren Kew is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and Executive Director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development as well. These are great titles and lofty departments that I wish we had replicated in some way, and perhaps we will. He studies the relationship between conflict resolution methods, particularly interfaith and interethnic peace building, and democratic development in Africa. Much of his work has focused on civil society, the role of civil society groups in this development. Professor Kew is part of a 5-year initiative to expand the work of the Interfaith Mediation Center of Kaduna, Nigeria, across greater portions of the country, and to learn from their approaches to Muslim-Christian dialogue. He's been a consultant on democracy and peace initiatives to the United Nations, to USAID, to the U.S. State Department, and to a number of NGOs, including the Carter Center. He monitored the last 4 Nigerian elections and the 2007 elections in Sierra Leone. Professor Kew is author of numerous works on Nigerian politics and conflict resolution, including the forthcoming book, Democracy, Conflict Resolution, and Civil Society in Nigeria. That will be coming out from Syracuse in 2015. And his articles have appeared in International Negotiation, the Journal of Democracy, and Current History, among other places. So it's a special treasure to have Darren Kew with us today to introduce a couple of the films that are featured in the work that he's done and that the pastor and the Imam have done in Nigeria. Thank you so much for coming. I can't think of a better way to kick off our discussion.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you so much. At UMass Boston, there's an inverse relationship between how much you paid and the length of the title. So we like these long titles. Anyway, thank you so much for letting me kick this off. Children are great for many things, most importantly as germ magnets. Mine have given me this head cold, so you have to forgive me if I'm sort of hacking or coughing a little bit during the conversation. I'll try to keep that to a minimum. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about two gentlemen in particular that I'm privileged to call friends. We've been working together for a number of years now. We drive each other crazy on numerous occasions, and I think that's a sign of a good working relationship. But they're the real stars of the show. So Liz really recommended, and I thought it was a great idea to start off by showing some elements of the films that are out there. Two documentaries that were made about them, and give you sort of, I think, a first glimpses to the work that they do. The films, unfortunately, the first one tells you their story, and I think that brings out a good portion of the theology that they're interested in. I'm going to show you a short clip of the second film that gets deeper into their methodology, but there's a little less of their theology in that component. So I'm going to just show you a clip to give you a sense of them in action. And then I'm going to talk for a few minutes just a little bit about what I've learned about the way that they work. And then we can have a more open discussion at that point. So let me just see if this is still queued up here. Okay, you noticed it didn't get deep into the actual methodologies of what they're doing. So this next clip gets a little bit deeper into their methodology, but unfortunately this clip you don't see as much of the theology and the religion component to it. But at least, I'll show you some of it, and maybe I'll try to fill in some of the blanks as best I can. I think you see at least sort of their personal journey in terms of the way their religion influenced them. That certainly was obvious there. Neither movie, I think, shows really well how they use religion, so to speak, in the work that they do. But let me see if I can at least find one piece that will be hopeful. So forgive me, this second film is based on an intervention they did when they went to Kenya, shortly after election conflict in 2007. So the groups that they're talking to are local Kenyan groups, and you'll see some mention of it. So they're doing a workshop in Kenya with members of two communities divided particularly by ethnicity. Although it's not obvious, there are some religious divides as well. But this is them doing one of their workshops, essentially. So you saw how initially they talk about what they like about each other, and then they present what they don't like about members of the other group. And you saw how Pastor and Imam go down through the list and start sort of having the other side comment on it. And it's essentially a stereotype exercise that tries to demonstrate how most of the stereotype elements are exaggerated wrong. Although there are a couple things in there that the groups take some ownership for. You saw where he said, "You've never burnt down a place of worship," and they start laughing, saying, "Well, we need to talk about that." Right? So they've maybe done it once or twice. Maybe not those individuals, but the community may have done it, right? So it's a stereotype drill, and then you'd see later in the film how they would form a peace committee. Let me turn this back on, I think. Yeah. So they'll form a peace committee from the. Is this too loud? Is it okay? So they'll form a peace committee from the two communities, and much like in the first film, they decide to do a festival, and where there's dancing and singing, and they try to bring together members of both communities. So let me just get too close to that. Okay. Let me try to sort of pull out a few of the threads of what we saw in the movie and to add to it a little bit based on my experience with them. As just to sort of lay the groundwork for a discussion we can have together. I'm very interested in hearing your impressions of what you've just seen. And maybe just to fill in just briefly a little bit of background on Nigeria and the context that we're working on. I think many of you know something about Nigeria, but just to reinforce, the first thing I'd like you to notice about the Nigerian map And what I like about it is the many colors on the map, which represents ethnicity. And Nigeria, like almost all the other African countries, was arbitrarily drawn by the colonialists 100 years ago, lumping together many, many different nations under one roof. And for most of Nigeria's existence, the ethnic dimension has been the primary identity factor in politics and in society to some extent. And so you see, it's hard to tell, but there's roughly 200 different ethnic groups in Nigeria. It's the most populous country on the continent, and ethnicity still is the primary political mobilization component. But what's happened over the last 20 years, a major proselytization effort on the part, particularly the Pentecostals, but the bigger churches as well, the Anglicans, the Catholics, others have gotten on board with this as well, moving up this way, particularly in this direction, through heavy, heavy proselytization efforts. And churches like the Pastors, the Church of Christ in Nigeria, have been at the forefront of this. And if we'd been having this talk in 1960, we would say there'd be roughly 50% Muslims in the country, 35% Christians, and 15% traditional religions. So much of that proselytization wave took place in the traditionalists in the Middle Belt regions. And Pastor James' community would be one of those communities that in the last 20, 30 years have converted. Now, that is to say that traditional religions have not gone away. Sometimes they're overlapping in terms of people's practices. But roughly now, the country is now roughly 50-50 Muslim-Christian. And this line that I've put through the country is a very, very rough division of where that divide is. It's certainly not that clean. But along that sort of area is where you find a great deal of divided communities. And Kaduna right here, where they're working, is right at the epicenter of this. The Yowa Shandem, where they're working, is in Plateau. The city of Jos, some of you may have heard in the news, is based in this area. So a lot of Muslim-Christian violence in this direction. And then all the way up to here into Borno State, which is now roughly 35% Christian, is the home of Boko Haram, which is a movement that's been getting a lot of action in the media lately, obviously, that you've heard. And this is the context in which groups like this are developing at the current point. I think the important thing to maybe just remember about some of this demographics is that one of the things that has managed to hold Nigeria together over the years is its ethnic plurality, is that there was a tremendous amount of room for inter-ethnic accommodation, and there were many different groups to build alliances politically over time. But what's been happening in the last 10 years in particular is the major political parties have been increasingly moving towards religious affiliation. And what happened was, and you heard Imam Ashafa talk about how, Pastor James's group, we always looked down on them, is for years and years and years, the Hausa majority living in the north dominated the Middle Belt minorities along the an ethnic divide and rule policy. But in the last 10 years, these many ethnic minorities have discovered politically that they belong to the great Christian majority, in their opinion. And like good politicians, Nigerian politicians have discovered that playing the religious card gets them votes, and it works well. And so the current president, who is from a Christian minority group in the South, has been saying all across the Middle Belt, look, I'm one of you. Keep me in power, and I'm going to look after your interests. And so naturally, this is creating increasing political friction along the lines. And you won't be surprised that the main opposition party is likely to run a Muslim candidate from the north against the Christian president from the south. And so this growing tension along religious lines is happening. And so what used to be sort of a multi-layered chessboard or many different sort of groups that were out there is growing increasingly bipolar in Nigeria. And a circumstance of you're either this group or that group is increasingly becoming the day. And I remember being in Northern Ireland, actually, in the early 1990s. I was visiting a friend, and she was working for a human rights group there. And she had a friend, an American friend who was there, and this American friend happened to be Jewish. And she would tell the story of she would go into, hang out, at the pub or something, and people would say, so what religion are you? And she'd say, I'm Jewish. And people would say, yeah, but are you a Catholic or Protestant Jew? And so,
I confirm this or deny their story later, but this is what she was saying in the same way. And so in the same way in Nigeria, people are increasingly saying, yeah, all right, you're from here, you're from there, but are you Muslim or are you Christian? And so this sort of increasing polarization is fueling along religious lines. And I think that's sort of an important context to think about the work that they're doing, is how you've got this heightened sense of religious affiliation within the complex web of politics that is connecting in. Another thing I think it's important to remember about conflict scenarios in general, and certainly in Nigeria, where I think when you first study conflict, you kind of expect to go in to find that the two communities don't think they know much about each other. But actually it's quite the opposite, is that communities in conflict actually think they know quite a bit about each other. They may not be right, but they think they know it. Oh yeah, we know that community over there. We know what the Muslims are like. They're like this and this. We know what the Christians are. I know what those Christians are. They believe the following things. So it's actually getting into this work, and much of sort of watching how James and Ashafa work. A lot of sort of the first steps in the methodology is it's not sort of just introducing people to the other religions. You're actually having to try to turn back the clock and to try to get them to take another look at something that they think they already know really, really well. I've lived around Christians all my life. I know how they think. I know what they do. Why do I need to engage in some sort of process that's going to get me to know that community in a deeper fashion? And even more so, it gets harder when not only do I know the people from that community, but they've killed somebody I know and I love. I know who they are, right? I know what they're like. They're vicious, they're animals, etc. So you've got to somehow try to get folks to ratchet back from that. And so that's the sort of context that we're working in, and where I think the religious dynamics of these two individuals sort of bring up some really interesting learning that I'm just at the beginning of this research project with. As Professor Eck mentioned earlier, that we've been working with IMC now for about 4 or 5 years. And one element of what we're trying to do is to learn from what they do. So what I'm about to show you is very preliminary. I'm beginning to get some harder quantitative data. Most of it is qualitative data based a lot on interviews and just working with them, a little bit of participant observation over the last few years. There's a few of us here from conflict resolution and very familiar with notions such as contact theory. And many of our theories talk essentially from a perspective that if you just get people together, and I'm not doing any of these theories full justice, but essentially much of our methodologies in conflict resolution is predicated on a sense that if you get people together, if you just get them in the same room, they are eventually going to find each other. That it's based on a sense of experience. And in order sort of to have this turning back the clock effect, you have to have people experience each other in a very different way. Right? And so Professor Herb Kelman here at Harvard pioneered a method, a workshop method, which is really, I think, in my opinion, still very much kind of one of the flagship methodologies, though we all have adopted it and adapted it in 100 different ways. But much of what we do in conflict resolution, particularly with deeply divided, violent societies, is to try to get small groups of people into a room so that they can experience each other in a different way and which can disconfirm their sense of what they know about each other. And so that second clip that we saw in Kenya was exactly what they were trying to do. And you saw how they divided the groups first, get them talking in smaller sections, get them opening up a little bit, and then bringing them back together, but doing it in a managed fashion so that they can sort of quietly begin to, or sort of slightly begin to get to know each other in gradual steps, and to get experiences of each other that disconfirms what they think they knew about that other person. And you saw as well they were trying to hammer away at those stereotypes and those other elements that are divisive. I think anybody in the business can tell you this can take a long time, is that getting people to walk that road where they're willing to actually let go of those grievances, let go of that pain, can take a tremendous amount of time. Professor Kelman talked about it, you'd have to have at least 3 encounters of the workshop model. Others will tell you it takes even much longer. You have to do it on a regular basis. And then not only after the workshops are done, you have to have follow-up over the years in order to get that sort of behavior change. So it's a tremendously difficult thing. So one of the things that really interested me about what James and Ashafa are doing, and it's not just them, it's their whole organization, which is, consists of imams and pastors of like mind like them. Much of what they're trying to do has an interesting impact. What I suggest is, well, first, before I get to the leapfrog effect, first and foremost is any of the conflict resolution folks here, I think, would have recognized very much what the methodology, what they're doing here. And sort of lock, stock in our trade is the personal narrative. And so the first thing they do, and you saw Pastor James sort of holding up his prosthetic arm, they tell their own story. And this is something I think any conflict resolution person would recognize, is that the first step in the method is they talk about what they've experienced. And they say, this is where we've been. And as you saw, the story in itself is tremendously powerful and moving. And I think that's one important piece of the success of what they do, is telling the story. And they've got such a moving story. And maybe one interesting piece for the discussion group might be this question of, are there other sort of similar elements or sort of examples out there elsewhere in the world of former enemies that are working together in this way? There are a lot of examples of ecumenical initiatives of folks who are already sort of peace inclined, and they've all sort of suffered. But I've been curious to find out more examples of actual, direct enemies who tried to kill each other on occasion and then reconciled. In that sense, James and Ashafa, at least in the Nigerian context, are pretty unique. There are some other examples out there, but it's not frequent. But so they tell their story. And it's a moving story, and that, I think, begins to open people up. But the other thing that's really interesting in their work that at least I'm finding having increasing impact is the impact of their status. And this would be, I think, another maybe interesting question for us to think about is, Nigeria is a tremendously religious society. So I'm wondering, just how transferable this model is to other places. In the Nigerian context, though, as you saw, I think, when in the opening scenes where the imam and the pastor are there speaking to everyone, to the crowds, and in the imam's case, people coming up and touching his hand, and then, you take it up to your, you take sort of the touch of the imam up to your face, and you sort of transfer that energy and that blessing to yourself and so on. It matters a lot to people. It's a very religious society. So the status that they hold is tremendously important. And I find that I'm leading towards the conclusion that's an important key to unlocking the sort of the puzzle of the impact that they're having, is the fact that they are authority figures in a religious context is tremendously important in helping folks that have been through these tremendously traumatizing, bloodletting events to leapfrog experience that if I were doing it, if we were doing sort of a normal workshop, a conflict resolution workshop, would take much, much longer. Is that because, and I could boil it down to as simple as saying, because the imam says, or because the pastor says, I have to reach out to these people, I'm going to do it. Because the imam or the pastor have that sort of religious authority. They have this sort of credibility in the community, and so I'm going to go that extra step than if I had just done a simple conflict resolution, conflict resolution workshop model, something along those lines, would take me much longer. Even if, if I'm coming in as an outsider from the United States working in Kaduna, I still have to, it's going to take me a long time to have folks do that, to walk that walk, and to be able to find each other in a way. But with that sort of extra religious muscle, so to speak, of the religious figures behind it, helping to open people up in the first place. So, creating an openness to change, first and foremost. But also the emotional and sort of grievance baggage. And baggage is not the right word because it trivializes it. These are tremendous suffering that people have been through. But these terrible emotional blocks that can take a tremendous amount of time to get over. Because the religious figures are encouraging this, seems to be a really, really important, at least part of the solution in the Nigerian context. And I would argue that obviously in other very deeply religious societies, I think an interesting question would be the transferability one that I mentioned. How does this hold up in other countries that maybe are not as sort of religious as Nigeria, or where religion is juxtaposed with other very important social glue and organizing principles that bring people together. And then, of course, the sort of the modeling is that in this sort of standard workshop model, I have to actually experience you in a different way across that line. Is that it seems like in many circumstances, because the imam and the pastor are modeling it for me, I don't necessarily have to get to know those people from the other community right away in the context of the workshop. So that the modeling in itself might be enough under some circumstances, and we're trying to test, but it seems to be at least going in that direction. Another really interesting thing about this, though, and this in addition to the status, is unlike us as sort of secular practitioners in conflict resolution, because the imam and the pastor are engaging religion, the follow-up happens every Friday or Sunday. Every time the practitioners go to mosque or church after this, there is an indirect encouragement or support system that instead of having to hold another series of workshops, the participants simply have to go to church or go to mosque. And it gives that additional backup that we can't do as secular practitioners unless we hold lots and lots of workshops or we hold follow-up meetings and that sort of thing. So the fact that the religious institution is engaged provides that sort of backup that I think is really important. Now, all of these things are sort of extra theological in the sense that the status in itself, we could use this particular model and we could say, okay, we're talking about religious figures in Nigeria. If we go to Boston, would we use status based on sort of say some sort of other element? So in other words, we could test this model and say in a Boston context and an extra religious circumstance. Although I'm arguing that there are elements here, obviously, that religion are tremendously important. I want to talk about religion specifically, is that they're not just conflict resolution people. They're not just like me in that sense. Is the fact that they are religious figures, I think, is tremendously important. And their theology is really important in what they do. And I'd like to just present a few of those pieces for our discussion. And then we can, I think, get into talking a little bit more about sort of the nuts and bolts of what they've been doing. So an important piece of this is in both Islam and Christianity are the narratives of forgiveness. We talk in conflict resolution, and this is something everyone knows about, the difference between a ceasefire and a real stable peace scenario. How do you get from simply a ceasefire based on coexistence, where we just tolerate each other, to an actual real integration of societies where we actually have a stable peace scenario? And forgiveness is one interesting component of this that religious figures can bring that someone like me cannot. Is that religious figures bring the theology of forgiveness with them in their own way. Christianity, in its many forms, has its perspective on the matter. Islam has its own perspective on the matter. But both of these perspectives are tremendously powerful in motivating practitioners on both sides, and in particularly highly religious societies where religion has such a role in Nigeria. The discussion of forgiveness, and this is something that they talk about regularly, is an essential piece of the puzzle. And I don't think we heard as much of it. We heard it between the two of them, and they talk about that. If we were sitting in their workshops, particularly across the religious divide, we would hear them talking about it. They would start quoting chapter and verse from the sacred texts or from the Sunnah, right? And other on the Christian side, other sort of traditions that they might talk about of forgiveness and saying how important this is, and this is what you must do, and this is how you heard Imam Ashafa talk about if the prophet went through what he went through, and if he can forgive, who am I not to do this sort of thing? So that's exactly what you would see in a workshop on their part, where they would be working with people. And it tends to help at least to provoke emotional release and to sort of this letting go of the grievance, or at least starting a process of letting go and apology, both of which, in the field, the importance of both of these things are tremendous. And so the theology is an essential piece of this. And then second, another thing that they do is promote the discussing of each other's religion. And I think this is something the ecumenical movement does worldwide. And I think if you were to see it in Nigeria, you'd recognize it. If you do it here, it'd be very, very familiar. Is that they definitely try to provoke circumstances where members of the opposing populations are talking about each other's religion. And so this can be done in a variety of different ways. You saw the sort of the stereotype drill that they were doing in Kenya. They would do a similar thing with Muslims and Christians, talking about what do we think is good, what do we think is bad about the other side, to try to break down those stereotypes. But then, at a more sort of a progressed stage, we'll sit down with a Bible and the Quran, and we'll read each other's sacred texts. And what's important about these two is not just simply alerting people to what each other's sacred texts are, but what's really fascinating as well is the discord within each other's own side. So it's really important for the Muslims to see the Catholics and the Pentecostals arguing about a particular element of Scripture. It's really important for the Christians to see the Sufis and the Salah, which is sort of more of a Nigerian Wahhabist version, arguing about the importance of particular practices or particular verses in the Quran. And so it's really important for both sides to see that neither one is monolithic, and neither one is 100% convinced about other issues, and they themselves may be self-conflicted. So that sort of intra-group dynamic is just as important as the intergroup dynamic. Good. I mentioned stereotypes as well, getting beyond preconceptions and stereotypes. And then, of course, the motivation for the work. The religion is tremendously central for both of them. You heard them talking about their own path and how they constantly have to go back to the religion. This is difficult work, to say the least. And so the religion itself is an essential vehicle for them in terms of keeping them motivated, keeping them able to continue to work on this. We saw sort of the success stories in the film. What we didn't see are all the failures that happen on a regular basis. And failure maybe is too strong a word, but certainly our efforts that try to get so far and only get so far. And sometimes the communities don't want to go further than what they do. And they're constantly under threat for the work that they do. That last section, I think there's a part in the film, but I've heard them say it as well, where they joke about saying, look, we don't preach Chrislam. And this is sort of the joke around that they're trying to create some sort of hybrid Christianity-Islam. And they love to joke with one another where the Imam will say, I'm still hoping to convert him. And the pastor will say the same thing. And they're telling the truth, actually. And that joke, by the way, about the pastor, wanting to smother the Imam in his sleep, he's still, I think there are moments I can see where he's still thinking about it, where, they drive each other crazy on a regular basis. They're strong-willed people, but also on theological issues. They're true believers. They really believe in what they do, and they really believe their religion, and they really believe that their religions are telling them that they must make peace with and live with people from the other side. So they constantly go back to theology and to the religious traditions in order to fortify themselves. You noticed also both of them talked about this moment where they felt like their mentors were talking directly to them during particular sermons, and that feeling of connection, of being chosen, I think, is a really important piece of this for them. A pastor talked about that time where, in the joke about still wanting to smother Ashafa, how one of his mentors said, look, you can't preach Christ with hate. You've got to change your ways. So they are constantly turning back to the religion to do this, and when they're doing their workshops, they are constantly sort of referring to religion and to religious dogma and to religious practice, and it means a tremendous amount. And I've seen, the people in the trainings come up to them and talk about them. And they will come up, and what's really fascinating is you will see a Muslim come up to the pastor and have a little theological debate. And say, but doesn't the Bible says X, Y, Z? And don't you Christians believe this, this, and this? And the conversation goes from there. And those exchanges are really, really important. And of course, it's being modeled in front of others who are listening during this discussion. And it opens up an environment and a conversation that is often very, very difficult to have. So I think I've covered most of the points I wanted to raise from the work.
It might be good just to get a more general conversation together. So maybe the best way to start is just if you have any questions or contributions, Usra, yeah.
So you actually referenced this really briefly, maybe after the second video. Yes, after the second video. I'm curious if the model is focused on.
Yeah, could we speak up a bit?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, maybe just get up and say
I will
something.
get
Yeah.
up. So, if the model is focused on working with people in leadership positions in religious communities, does that automatically exclude the participation of women and youth? And I'm wondering if their work accounts for or includes, maybe outside of what's depicted in the videos, that they actually do work with other types of folks, or is this where their work is focused?
Yeah, thank you. But there's a tremendous sort of social pressure against youth to confront elders. And so this has created, I think, a circumstance where political leadership, certainly, and religious leadership tends to be on the older side. And it's a very restricted channel for youth to move up the ranks, and it takes a long time to get up there. So for a lot of unemployed youth, it's been, you know, a real exclusion. So trying to break through that is both a sort of a political and economic component, but it's also a theological question in many ways too, and theological influenced by culture, you know, a very status-oriented culture and a very age-oriented culture.
So you mentioned that the youth are involved in much of the violent conflict, and so I'm wondering, so this is a follow-up question, and then I'll stop. Is then the workshop that they lead, is that sort of the easy audience? How do they measure if they're being successful or not in the model, or the social change that they're trying to make? Is it that the men that come to these workshops are men who are maybe somewhat open to these types of conversations anyway, and have they thought about, well, how do we actually make more substantial change by pulling in some of the folks that maybe don't want to be in them?
So are we talking just at the youth dynamic, or just in general, impact in general?
I think a little both. I mean, assuming that, you know, it's really the youth involvement in violent conflict that's at the core of that is at the core of the challenges that they're facing. That, and then if you could speak more generally.
Yeah, so they're definitely, they do a lot of workshops with youth, and, you know, youth are easier to engage because, you know, generally speaking, they have more freedom, and that, you know, many have more time on their hands because they don't have work, that kind of thing. But also, too, they're just more energetic and interested in these matters. And so, and again, as religious figures, when they send out the call, people have to show up. You know, they don't have to, but they feel that tremendous obligation to do so, and so people will come. So the youth certainly are engaged in much of the work that they do, and they've gotten, I think, at least on that angle, far more interested in mentorship in a way that I think is really helpful in that sense, and trying to not just mentorship for mentorship's sake, but to actually try to create real structures whereby youth can have a place in hierarchies and in local communities and so forth, that gives them a sense of ownership and belonging. That's important. In terms of measuring impact, we're trying to, this is one of the things we're working with them on. I think it's something that an academic institution has, you know, practitioners are out there doing this stuff all the time. So as an academic institution, we're trying to help them set up, you know, better systems of measurement. So we, earlier this year, got a baseline survey going with them in terms of the communities that they're working in. We've encouraged them to think in terms of a target neighborhood strategy. So, you know, they're just one organization with 20 people who are tremendously dynamic, but Nigeria's got 160 million people, and they're supposed to be working in 6 different states, which would have at least, you know, 24 to 30 million people altogether. So the impact is, you know, it's really hard. So we had them go through a thought exercise to think about what are the sort of the neighborhoods where are the usual suspects in the states that they're working in. So when something's going down, what are the ones that are usually involved? And then we also had them think about a neighborhood or two that are model communities, that are integrated communities that have not fallen apart because they're doing something right. And we want to help them and we want to work with them. And so there's about 5 or 6 neighborhoods in each of the 6 states. And so we've done a baseline survey looking at things in terms of a wide range of data, how religiously divided the societies are, and usually by asking the people themselves, how divided do you think things are? We're following, you know, nuts and bolts things like incidents of violence, but we're following peace data as well, so number of peaceful, you know, committees that have met, that kind of thing. So we've got some qualitative and quantitative data we're working with them on. Please, ma'am, in the back. Yes.
I just to follow up on that question, actually, I'm intrigued by your mentioning that women's networks. There are women's networks. Are these cross-religious? So I kind of am wondering whether it implies that the formal organization, they're just not part of the formal organization, but something very important is going on apparently between the women.
There are formal networks and informal networks. So the one in particular, there's a formal network called Women's Interfaith Network in northern Nigeria, which has a wide membership, and they're the ones working on a shoestring budget of money that they themselves have raised. And so they do have a formal office, and I think maybe more than one office that I think they flop on a couple of offices, and they have a headquarters. And then there are a number of other interfaith networks, or oftentimes some of the so-called mainstream organizations may have a women's wing, they call it, and those will then network together and go on and do sort of separate project work in a way. And then there are the informal networks as well that, of relationships that are also very active. Thank you. Yes, please.
What languages we're talking about here? Because Imam Ashafa talked about the sort of repugnance he had felt toward, the Western-oriented curriculum in schools because of the colonial effect. But then we have all of the Christians who are, in many ways, proxies for, are part of that whole Western movement. And are they more comfortable in English? Does English speaking or not speaking, education or not education play into this? Because, what language do they speak, and how do they, how is that inflected in?
Yeah, in the Middle Belt regions in particular, the Christian minorities still primarily speak Hausa in addition to their own local language, because it was the lingua franca during the Hausa domination period. And the majority of the Hausa speakers still speak Hausa first and English second, even though English is the formal language, the official language of Nigeria. Yeah. And it's it's the official business and all that sort of thing. But on the streets and in the countrysides, it's really Hausa that you find. But you might or might not have noticed when Pastor James is preaching at one point in Hausa, he screams out God, but he says Yallah, which is the Hausa word, obviously, which obviously comes from Allah. And for a lot of the Christian minorities, they look at that and they say, wait a minute, that's the wrong word. We're speaking the Muslims' language when we say these things. And so I think there is a movement towards English as precisely that sort of, not Hausa language. It's the one language that's out there. But I think still, you'll find that most folks are speaking Hausa.
An antipathy to English on the part of many of the others?
On the Christian side, not an antipathy. On the Hausa side, yes. Yes, and in fact, Imam Ashafa's comment about Western education being forbidden is the exact translation of Boko Haram. And Boko Haram comes from that same tradition of seeing, the Western imposed state is corrupt, and it's corrupt because it's lost its way, and it does not embody the true religion, and they're corrupting our children by sending to these so-called secular schools, but which are really Christian schools, because they come from the British tradition. And that whole sort of, logic is certainly very much there, and that's where, Boko Haram harkens to that. Yes, please.
You talked about contact theory, and I'm curious about indirect contact theory. You mentioned that these people go to the workshops, and then they go to their home religious communities, and they get support for the sort of peaceful leanings that they learn in the worshiping communities. But both of these guys started out religious leaders who were very anti-peace, and I'm just wondering how widespread is a sort of pro-peace sentiment among the religious leaders, and how much do these people who go to the workshops seem to affect the culture of being pro-peace in their home worshiping communities?
Yeah, on contact theory, it's a hotly contested theory for a variety of reasons. And there's a contagion effect, like you're talking about, is that, so I go into one of these workshops and I take it home to my community, to my family, and so on. But there's also a bubble effect in the sense that, when you leave the workshop, the bubble bursts and you're back in the real world. and I revert back to my previous pattern without, regular follow-up from the workshops and so forth. So James and Ashafa, I think, just through the durability of their relationship, has been an important sort of insulation in keeping the bubble from bursting, so to speak, because they went through so much together and they worked so hard together, and they've created this organization around them which is a constant sort of reinforcement of their relationship. And I don't remember in the clips I showed, they both constantly talk about themselves as an old married couple, and how they feel like they're stuck in that sense. They're for life, they need to connect to each other like that. And stuck was not the right word, forgive me, as a married, I'm very happily married. No, but they feel like, they can't break. Even during the hard times, it can't break. It wouldn't be a question of that. But when they go back to their communities, they still try to model this behavior. But, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you meant them. Forgive me.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like the people who go to their workshops, you said that when they go home to their worshiping communities, they get support for the workshop ideals, which helps reinforce the work of the workshop so that it doesn't just evaporate.
Yes.
And in other contexts, it's the opposite. In Northern Ireland, for example, people go to little ecumenical gatherings and they go back to their home church, which is virulently, anti-out-group, and it just kind of dissolves over time without the support. You seem to be saying, I thought you were saying that it was sort of the opposite there, and I'm wondering how progressive or how pro-peace are a lot of these worshiping communities, and whether the people who go to the workshops, when they go back to their worshiping communities, whether they spread more of a pro-peace movement in their worshiping communities and strengthen that voice within the multivocal nature of whatever the community is.
Yes, thank you for that. So yes, the strengthening factor happens in sort of a religious neutral mosque or church, in the sense that, so once I've gone through the workshop with the imam and the pastor, because they have lended religious strength behind what I've got to go through, simply going back to church or mosque reinforces that dynamic. Unless, as you're saying, I've got an imam or a pastor in my church who's preaching hate speech, essentially. So that could certainly reverse it, right? Or at least could create a dynamic where you have that participant coming back and saying, wait a minute, I'm getting, different views here. So I don't mean to suggest it's sort of, a locked-in thing that after they're in the workshop, it's a said and done. But what's at least the added benefit to the religious workshop, as opposed to sort of a workshop I might do, is that there is this sort of reinforcement that happens when going back to the religious circumstances. But you're absolutely right, is that also there are all sorts of intervening variables there, most especially the local imam and pastor in my own church or my own mosque. And if they're saying something that's very contradictory or very inflammatory, it could certainly reverse that pattern in me, or I may be conflicted in those moments. But it's also why I think part of their strategies to try to find those imams and pastors and try to bring them into workshops. So you've got sort of a more citizen-based workshop model, and then they'll go after the leadership in the various communities. And that's always been their forte, is they work with imams and pastors first. They try to get them in. And so when they go into a new community, that's their first point of call, is they'll go to the various pastors and imams in the community in question, bring them together, introduce them to the method, try to get them to talk more about what's going on, and then ask their permission to go to the congregations and to engage them for precisely that concern. And if the imams and the pastors are on board, then it creates at least a more enabling environment. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, please, sir.
I was struck by the elements of humor that we saw, particularly in this second video clip that we watched, and in conjunction with the conversation of stereotypes that came up, it really struck me that ridicule is often, the evil twin of humor, and ridicule often comes with stereotypes. And in this process of breaking down stereotypes that we saw in the reconciliation process in that second video, there's this movement from laughing at, like ridiculing others, to laughing with, to laughing, together. Yeah. And I'm wondering, like, what role, what role is humor, like an intentional strategy employed in the reconciliation process, or what are other creative ways of using humor, to laugh together instead of at?
No, absolutely. Pastor James is a really funny guy. And it's a real tool, and it's a real asset, and he uses it left. So it's, I've never asked him that exact question, but it's got to be a part of his, his conscious effort. And I've seen him, he, like all of us, he uses the same joke a few times, and I've seen him use it under certain circumstances, so therefore it's got to be sort of a part of his strategy. So, and Imam Ashafa has also got a real sense of humor in his own way. That is interesting too. So they both definitely integrate it. And as you said, and as you saw, a real moment of success is when the parties are laughing together over something and laughing at themselves in ways, of, admitting to past wrongs that our side has done and admitting our weaknesses. But it's been done in a context where we've all admitted our weaknesses. And so it's funny in that way. So it's absolutely a central piece. Yeah. Please.
That was actually just the point I was going to raise. For me, the most striking moment in the whole film was, it's like a beautiful, I wouldn't have called it humor so much, but this beautiful moment when they're smiling and actually owning, that what's being said about them negatively is true. It just seemed phenomenal. I'm just wondering, what makes those moments, those must be rare moments, and what makes that moment possible? Do you think it was the particular, workup that kind of led to that? Is there some sort of cultural thing there that somehow, despite very strong passions and hatreds, there's also an ability to let it all go? I mean, is that some deep human thing that we should always try to find in the other? But it's just like an amazing moment when they say, yeah, I burned down a few churches, I killed some people. I mean, it seems almost incongruous to be smiling about it, but it seemed to be a really critical moment in the process.
Yeah, and there's no one method that works under every circumstance, of course, but yes, it's as you said, it's sort of I think it's the tail end of a series of steps, and their generic model is first sort of talking about their story, and and that's moving everyone. And then we move to sort of the religious dynamic where we start engaging the Holy Scriptures. We start talking about the importance of things like forgiveness. They'll mix it up depending on the crowd. And then we move through into the elements you saw, where first they may do something like the stereotype drills like we were seeing, where first I'll have the parties talk about what they like about each other, and then they'll talk about what they don't like about each other. So you've been through several steps by that point where you feel safe, at least safer. You feel open, or at least more open. And I'm arguing, I guess, that you also feel obliged because of the status role of the religious figures. And some of it's conscious, some of it I think is unconscious and cultural, where I feel like I'm here, and just as the religious figure is an essential part of the wedding, otherwise it doesn't feel like a wedding. The religious figure is there raising the level of the gathering, and so I'm in a sacred moment in that sense, and so I need to be something more, and I open up more, and so it brings out more of me. And obviously, not everyone goes through this path, but like the ones we saw, I think that's my sense of what those are the steps that are happening. Yes, please, in the back.
Well, first of all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I feel like given this gift, it feels like an intimate glimpse into these men's lives, which is really nice. And it's made me think about, there was a scene where they had the rally and they talked about how they were getting some international press. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, as this kind of starting off as a localized movement has gotten more and more attention, sort of the positive and negative effects, and sort of what's being done now to keep the effects positive and to help the movement keep its strength.
Yes, there's a tremendous amount has happened over, they've been doing this for 20 years now. And so when they started, they were young hotheads who had reconciled, and they still had street credentials, with the radical communities. But then what happened is that they've been discovered by the international community. And they've gotten a number of awards overseas in many places, and so they work with people like me. So I think that they don't have that same kind of radical credentials. So they themselves have morphed into sort of a embodiment of a particular type of the peace movement, and that creates tensions for both sides for them. So the hardcore Christians and the hardcore sort of, for lack of a better word, Islamists on the other side, feel like you betrayed. What are you doing, fraternizing with those people? What are you talking? And so that's a constant sort of tension that they're under. And the imam has gotten a number of death threats. I think the pastor has as well. And so this is a constant, tension that they face. And so they are, part of what they're trying to do is to, create a second generation of imams and pastors who can fill in some of those gaps that they themselves don't have anymore, or they don't. Sorry, please. Yes, please.
Because obviously these things got made, and there's the SAID at back sponsoring and so on. I'm just wondering how much of a problem that has been for them. I know Imam Ashafa talked a little bit about this when we met, but do some of the people that are working with see this, whole peace building effort as a kind of Western plot to kind of erode their religion and their culture? So it's not just their own celebrity status, but it's the linkages they're making and how that's interpreted by the respective communities.
Yeah, I do think it's certainly made things more difficult for them, and so trying to build these coalitions. But that's been an insulating factor, I think, in one sense, is that since they're not as well known locally, they're known in the communities that they work, and I think in the communities where they've had impact, like Yawash and Dam and others, they've got a really good reputation. But they don't have the sort of, they're not seen as sort of the peacekeepers you call in Nigeria when something goes down. It's only in the communities that they're working in, and that's ironically, I think, had a safeguard for them. But I think it's a problem they've got to wrestle with in terms of having greater national impact. I saw another. Okay, yes, please. Okay, you haven't had a chance to speak, and then ma'am, after you. Yeah.
So, thank you for saying what you just said, because I come from Israel and Palestine, and I'm very involved in that. And in the end of the day, after 30 years, we learned the dialogue doesn't work in many ways, and it became part of the occupation and the status quo. And then now we try to do totally different way, which is dialogue is one way. It's just a tool, but the goals is totally different. Is to teach the people how to do nonviolence action and how to change their community. Because we became the people who made dialogue became like the good people, but like the children who play, and it doesn't do any change. So thank you for saying that, and I really wonder what you are going to offer them and what will be the next steps, because in a way we are in the same boat. And my question is, since I work with Interfaith, so one of the tools that we find that we must do at least with the rabbis, imams, and priests is not just to lose the language of the religious language, just to speak about how to overcome the anger and the pain, as you mentioned and we saw in the movie, but also slowly to learn to speak about how our religions bring us to be violent. So I didn't see it in the movie, and I wonder if you can say something about that.
Yeah, on the second question, I would say they tend to avoid talking about the rough edges of the religion. I think only coming from a perspective of everybody walking in sort of already has that perspective, is that the participants, and I think this might be wrong on their part, but I think it's a presumption that people are coming in already feeling like the religion is sort of, is at least looking at the other person's religion is part of the problem, and they're well aware of sort of religious stereotyping, although they may not call it that, but they have a sense of what the stereotypes are. So I think they try to immediately move back to talking about what are the assets that religion brings in terms of moving things forward. But I'd be curious to think as to whether they move in that direction, to thinking about talking about what the harder edges are. I mean, certainly, like if you see in the stereotyping exercise, they'll go through a situation where each of the other side will talk about what's wrong with the other person's religion. So that comes out in the conversation. And they do try to get people to take ownership, as you saw, of some of what's going on. Yes, our community did, burn down a mosque. Yeah, we know that. We have to take ownership for that. So those things begin to at least, take gel. But I don't think it's gone as far as you're suggesting. On the first part, definitely, I think that one of the things, the conflict resolution world, I think, has had trouble dealing with the scaling up question methodologically, because I think we've been afraid of politics. because of the real push for neutrality and impartiality. It's an essential piece of what we do. But when you get more than 10, 20 people in a room, you've got politics. And especially if you've got 20 important people in the room, that's a political meeting. So one of the things I've been working with them to think about, and that they were there already, so they're teaching me really about is thinking politically, strategically about conflict resolution activities, and assuming that, okay, this is a political event that we're having here. So then what? What does that mean? Who do we need to talk to in the political communities? Who are the political leaders we need to connect to? But also, too, I think they're moving in a direction of the nonviolence methodologies. And one thing Imam Ashafa was talking about, just last year, and I think he just got away from it, but I think he still wants to get back into it. He's like, we got to build a movement. We need a movement. We need thousands of people out there filling the streets. And I said, well, what happens when you put several thousand people in the streets? This is a very different, thing than having, 20, 30 people in a workshop. You're unleashing forces that are amazing, but also tremendously dangerous. And so I think there's a rediscovery of the nonviolent social organization movements through a political lens that I think is really important, and we're learning right along with them. So, yes, please.
So this thought is coming from what you were saying earlier about traditional conceptions of gender roles and things like that. And I'm curious whether you've come across people in this work who seem to not be as worried about violence, where the whole conception of nonviolence as being something that we should be working towards, whether people are seeing nonviolence at all as a cultural thing, as a Western idea. Or whether, I understand that people probably grieve loss, grieve death, grieve killing. I'm also curious to know whether it's perceived in the same way as, of course, this needs to change on a societal level, on a cultural level.
Help me understand. So are you asking whether the nonviolence approach is seen as imported in that sense, or as a Western element? I think some of the methodologies, there's some sense that this is foreign to us. So some of the workshop elements certainly seem like it's something that I think to participants that is imported. But James and Ashafa and everyone in the organization have been, I think, masterful at indigenizing it. It's full of local, cultural elements, and obviously, and the religious component makes it local in that sense. So I feel like that it hasn't. I haven't seen them mention it as a barrier yet.
I just have a sense, without knowing anything about Nigeria, and so I'm not asking necessarily a Nigeria-specific question, but I know that ideas about warfare and whether it's okay or not, or how it stands in terms of questions of morality, I know that that's just culturally varied. And so this desire for there not to be conflict, I'm just curious if everyone's on the same page there.
There are definitely different cultural variation across Nigeria, and then across the religions as well. So there's no doubt, they're not on the same page, but there are certainly overlaps, I guess, in that sense. Thank you. Please.
I don't want to mention other people, but one thing that struck me in the films, the extended versions, is the importance of kind of ritual and dance and music. And constructed rituals of of going out and burying things as a way of, and I was just wondering how important is that all of these art, ritual, dance, music, collective expressions are to these processes, because it did seem quite important in the way that they built their.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a central piece of it. And I think it also shows the overlap. Both Islam and Christianity, of course, are imported into Nigeria in that sense. And so, and how they came in and they incorporated a tremendous amount of local practices. And so that's a very, a Nigerian African body of traditions that have been incorporated. And they work it in wherever they can, because it provides, it's not just, it's fun. And in that sense, going back to your humor question in some way as well, I mean, making people, bond together and that happy sense being really important. But it has a deeper, I think, traditional gravity to it, that when the dance is engaged, it's made it something sacred, I think, in that way, that is very, very important and essential, and provides that additional glue.
Because they had one thing, didn't they, where they actually wrote down the grievances and then had a symbolic burying of them, didn't they?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Please.
Just a quick comment and a question. So first, it's amazing. I mean, the story that you're sharing with us and your experiences is fully amazing.
Thank you.
And I was thinking, in a way, it seems like there's the challenge of deep, deep pain and the depiction then, the realistic depiction of deep, deep healing. And I got to thinking about a former mentor of mine, Jerome Frank, who was at Johns Hopkins. And he wrote a book a number of years back called Persuasion and Healing. And he looked at healing from an anthropological perspective and said, what makes therapy, psychotherapy, a healing process? And he said 3 or 4 basic things. One, you need a healing context. You need someone who's seen as a healer, culturally as a healer. And you need some sort of process that people deem legitimate as a healing process. And it seems like at a core level, that's what you're sharing. So the status, it all comes into that very fundamental story. My question is a little bit different, but it goes to that process of healing. It seems like the community went through multiple stages. There was the massive, there was the moments of full violence. There were the flare-ups, and then there was this more stable peace. And the Imam and the pastor moved into the direction of forgiveness. I was just curious to hear more about your perspectives. What did that process of forgiveness look like? What did you learn from them about that process, both from a personal perspective, an interpersonal, and a group and intergroup process? The complexity of forgiveness there seems enormous, and it seems also very successful.
Yeah, my impression of the process for forgiveness, very much, I think the film captures some of it, is it had to begin with their internal journey. Is that they first of all, they had some recognition of something wasn't right in terms of the way that they were there. But also you saw the really important role of mentors for both of them, is that they had religious figures talking to them, saying that you need to do something different. So I think it was a combination of themselves already starting down a road. So and in a way, I think that that brings in, I guess, that importance of experience, in the sense that they started things a little bit on their own, trying to experience each other differently, and then they had the sort of religious mentor sort of pushing them together. And so they had a longer process than, say, people typically in their workshops will have, so which might explain partly why theirs is more durable. So I think that, but still, I think it shows at least, some of the parallels between what they're trying to present in their workshops. And so I think the forgiveness road begins in those 2 steps for them. And they continue to try to do it. The healing part is interesting as well, is that they definitely have always said we do healing in the work that we do, but with the uptick in violence with the Boko Haram efforts, they've been engaged to deal with post-trauma stress disorder work. And they've begun to get some basic training in that. But I've been very nervous about it because, PTSD work is, you can do a lot of damage if you're not, you can't be a triage PTSD person. You can, for lack of, if something else, if there's nothing else better. But they're beginning to go in that direction, and they're starting to get sort of from the basic healing that they've been offering to actually getting a little bit into stress disorder related healing work. And it's such a technical expertise. We'll see how it develops. Yeah. Please. Oh, sorry.
I know time's moving on pretty fast. Would it be possible just to have? I know a number of people want to say things, and maybe we could just have a very quick comment, question, and then we'll just hold them together. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I know Charlie wants to say something, and was there someone here? Jeff? Yeah.
No, I had a question, but I'm happy to defer it. So.
Feel free to ask your question, and then we can pull them.
So you sort of implied that they've tried to make inroads or contacts at higher levels of sort of among social elites and whatnot, and to put it in kind of conflict resolution speak, it seems like a lot of what they're doing is at track 3, grassroots, maybe a little bit at track 2, as we might talk about, but at what are their goals if they were to penetrate into sort of track 1 official? What's the end game for them? What are they trying to achieve, and what's your take on the sort of resistance they've faced at the sort of official level?
Okay, thanks.
Charlie?
And then Anne.
Just a comment, question, it goes back to the issue about forgiveness where it's beginning. Pastor James, when he gives the narration of what happened, is that Imam Ashraf went to see his mother in the hospital. That's not really forgiveness, and the mentor of Imam Ashraf didn't say either one of those things. He said, you have a right to have vengeance, but you should forgive. But going to see the mother is another kind of thing. So then, the question is, do you have any idea why Imam Ashraf did that? And any explanation of why it had the power on Pastor James that it did? And whether that detail shows up in the workshops that they're doing, something that there's some practice that's meant to duplicate that moment of going, and it's something about going to see the mother in the hospital. It's not to James, it's going to see his mother.
And Anne, as well, say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if there's another level of leadership that can be engaged in the ethnic communities. Because it's interesting from a historical perspective, it's interesting to see you're coming in at a moment when these two imported traditions have become the identifiers, the polarizing identifiers. But when we saw in the Kenyan intervention, we didn't see the religious terminology being deployed. It was the ethnic identifiers. And so I wonder if there are other opportunities for engagement there.
The other last one, perhaps?
I just want to piggyback on, somebody else who didn't get a chance, I'm sorry. I just want to piggyback on what he asked, and ask whether in this kind of elite society where it seems very statist in their approach, very track one, and their possible attempts to try to work toward that, is there a role of sponsor states in either helping or hindering that? You mentioned sponsor states giving funds, but I'm wondering whether sponsor states are also trying to work to bridge that gap between the grassroots and the civil society versus the elite society.
So Dan, I'll give you a minute to
There we go.
give
Well, first, thanks to all of you. Let me think about the last leadership, the last question about cultural leadership. There definitely, in many communities, they will go to traditional chieftaincies, for instance, and other sort of traditional civil society actors who have some sort of influence and try to engage them as well. So they start with the religious figures, but they'll often go to a local chieftaincy, depending on the locality. They may go to an emir, or they may go to a chief, or they may go to other sort of traditional religious leaders in some circumstance. I've seen them, they've done trainings in the Niger Delta region, and they brought in the traditional Egbesu priests who were very popular among the oil militias at that point. So they will often turn to other cultural traditions as, to sort of fit that role in some way. Let's see, about going to see the mother, that's the sort of visiting folks when they've lost a loved one is such a sort of basic cultural practice in Nigeria. It's just such a, it's such an important one. And I think Ashafa chose it strategically in an effort to start the reaching out effort. It was something that had cultural protection, so to speak, that it would, even if he assumed that Ashafa had some sort of ulterior motive, he still would have to at least, welcome into his home and to at least receive the greeting. So it was a nice sort of opening, I think, and he figured that out. But I think you're absolutely right, and it gets back to maybe Dan's question about forgiveness as well. About the forgiveness didn't happen right away. It was, as he mentioned, with trying, harboring fantasies of killing him over several years, that forgiveness came in stages. There was sort of conditional forgiveness initially, that then later happened unconditionally. On track one, and what the end game might be for them if they were to engage in track one, I think that they themselves would certainly like to have the sort of national influence that, say, the bishops have, or some of the big Islamic leaders have in northern Nigeria, and I think they would very much like to play that. But I think they're increasingly thinking globally. They're very interested in continuing to develop their theology of interfaith. And so, they like to do a lot of different things at once. They've got multiple agendas, I think. So, but one of which is very much looking globally to learn more about what are the sort of interfaith theologies happening out there, and they want to continue to develop their own and present it out there. So I think they've got as much sort of global interests as they do sort of becoming national figures in that sense. And so I think that would be where they'd be happy if they had, they had that sort of status where they could have a seat at the table with other major religious leaders and have that sort of respect as bringing constituencies would be a part of that. Thank you.